And you said goodbye. Said you'd never leave me. Then you said goodbye. Said you loved me, but then you went away. Said you never leave me, but you never stay. Who knows what you're doing, but now I am lost. Just working on this new song. It's going on my keyboard in the background. I might talk about social democracies. Thought I might talk about political things. Again, my connection is unstable, but I don't care. So I'm continuing on from the same theme I had before. I was talking initially about how I thought there's really only two types of people in the world: creators and followers. Generally, a lot of creative people who think outside of the norm. Either one, they become leaders who direct new trends of style or engineering or ideas, or else they retreat completely away from society as a whole and work in isolation and become quite reclusive and alone in their own endeavours because they are so different from the general 99.9999% of other people who have still been trying to chip rocks only on one side and haven't caught on to the fact that you can actually make a better tool by chipping the stone on two sides. Like I was saying before, for 50,000 years, the human race didn't actually advance in our stone making technology because everyone did everything the same way. I guess in a sense you could call that being conservative. It's like keeping things to the established order and the way that they're done. Now, of course, if some clever guy hadn't come along and gone, oh, what happens if I chip the other side and see if I can make a sharper cutting tool in the Neolithic time, like I was saying in my earlier discourse, we probably would never have gone beyond living in caves and using stone cutting tools that only used a chipping method that chipped one side of the stone tool. So either several things happen to people who are creative or think outside of the square, find others who are creative like themselves, and they set up their own little communities where they start trying to basically develop their own way of doing stuff that's different to the already established carry-ons of the former others that they want to sort of evolve from. So it's a question of evolution, really. Our intelligence can't really have been, or can't really be that much more evolved than it was in those times, because our brain capacity is the same. We still apparently have the same genetic structure. So all of the capacities for thought and mental machinations of the mind are essentially the same as they were back then as they are now for Cro-Magnon, or Homo sapiens, which we are. I don't think there's really been much of a development in brain capacity. Then again, there has been in some people, and probably a reduction in others. So whether or not cranial capacity is actually an indicator of intelligence, that's another question entirely. But I want to get back to my same principle again, the idea that there are only two main types of people in the world: followers and not leaders, but creatives who tend to lead by example because they're doing things differently, but somebody thinks that that's good because they don't have any original ideas, because they more or less just imitate what they've been shown or how other people do things that they sort of like look up to. Maybe they don't really need to look up to them, but they know that is they learnt behaviours are the things that have been established by the former generations that have come before. And of course, we should always, I think, at least build on what has come before because of the marvelous things that have already happened. We've already invented so many things and had so many incredible discoveries. And we're flying around the solar system with drones that go to the furthest reaches of our planetary system, beyond even Pluto. Now, one of our drones has made it beyond the supposed limit of the extent of our entire solar system, is going into interstellar space, which is Voyager 1 and Voyager 2. And it's still sending us back information. That information actually has surprised a lot of astrophysicists and myself. There is more activity out beyond the solar boundary. Basically, the sun is in the center of the solar system, as probably anybody who's listening to this. Oh, one person is listening. I don't know who they are, but so the sun, right? We've got our Jovian planets, which are the giant gaseous ones, which are right out here, which are huge. They're huge. Jupiter is massive. It is so much bigger than Earth. Okay, so we've got little Earth, which is like a pea compared to the basketball of Jupiter. Well, it should even be bigger than a basketball, I think, if the Earth was the size of a pea. And the sun, of course, is, oh my God, the size of a car in comparison. So we've got the sun right, and way out there we've got the Jovians, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, and then we've got Pluto and a couple of other proto-planets or quasi-planets or planetoids, or it's not a planet anymore, unfortunately, but I still think it is a planet. It's absolutely beautiful. And Chiron, its moon, they look incredible actually in the latest shots that they've had of the recent probe. They went right out to explore and look at the objects that are out beyond the orbit of Neptune. In a zone where there are a lot of icy balls and things that sometimes end up turning into comets and coming back in closer to the inner planets in a strange eccentric orbit, sometimes to be burnt up by the sun and then zoom out again, then come back in again, and then they end up having this periodicity. Periodicity is the period upon which how long it takes for a comet or even a planet really to be in the same place in its orbit. Some of the periodicities of some of these comets that come in and out of near Earth orbit type thing and around the sun and back again are in thousands of years. Halley's Comet, I believe, is around about 75 years, I think. I saw Halley's Comet when I was younger, when I was about, I think I was about 11. I was at intermediate school and back then, and it wasn't all that impressive, nowhere near as impressive as the recent visitation that we had from that was seen so beautifully in the southern hemisphere, that I saw when I was in Golden Bay, that stretches across a much larger portion of the sky than Halley's. I even wrote a synthesizer piece based on that particular experience, and yes, so that comet was not actually in an orbit at all around Earth. It was just passing by and on its way through, and so that was McNaught. It was one of the McNaughts. There are actually a couple of McNaughts, and they were named after the hobby astronomer who found it coming in. But it turned out to be one of the most spectacular common events of recent decades or even the last century or so, even more spectacular than Halley's, as I remember seeing Halley's Comet. And Halley is due to return, I think, around about 2050. I think. Maybe another 20 years or so, and it'll come back again. Everyone will go, "Whoa! I know it's the end of the world." Everyone thought that the appearance of Halley's Comet was supposed to mean, and actually comets in general, was supposed to mean something, a sort of a terrible omen of disease and famine and horrible things were going to happen if you saw a comet, coming. So these are the superstitious beliefs that we lived by in the Dark Ages. Of course, we're not in the Dark Ages anymore. But generally getting back to my, schoolboy talk here. We're back in. I'm sort of musing on social studies, sociology. So we're looking at mainly. I am looking at mainly at how easily people are manipulated and controlled in society, or not so easily controlled and manipulated. And it all boils down again to the ability of each individual of how readily they either are creative and are inventive and think for themselves and try and work out other ways of doing things, or whether or not they are super conservative and just copy and follow exactly what everybody else is doing. So that's the two main types of people. I have sort of subdivided the human race into. You have like one of these creative type people for every several tens of thousands of these others. And unfortunately, being in the minority, the creatives often don't know how to fit themselves into society. They end up becoming artists, or they become crazy inventors, or they get involved in something, but they don't often fit in that easily because they're not doing everything exactly the same as everybody else. And sometimes they end up finding themselves in places like the performing arts, or researching plasma in dungeons of strange university faculties in obscure places like India, or working on all sorts of weird and wonderful things that nobody else understands because they haven't really the imagination or mental capacities to sort of, or haven't bothered trying to exercise their brains to that extent, or aren't curious enough about what is happening around them. Curiosity is one of the main things too. As a lot of people lose their curiosity. It's sort of, they assume that everything's pretty much as they sense it and see it around them. When if they look or delve further into, say, philosophy, they might realise that things aren't quite as they seem at first glance. For example, a friend of mine was discussing, do you get wetter when you run through the rain? If you run, are you going to end up getting less wet, getting to somewhere where you can be out of the rain, or walking? And it's very interesting. I thought obviously if you run, not going to be in the rain for as long, so it's not. It's obvious that you're not going to get as wet because you won't be under the rain for as long. But actually, it turns out, after he explained about how how your body presents to the falling droplets and all this other stuff, it sort of actually turns out that if you run or jog, you're extending your body. You're presenting more for the falling water droplets to go onto. Whether when you're walking, you've actually got a lot more underneath that's sort of keeping your legs aren't being extended out so far backwards and forwards, so the back of your legs aren't getting as wet. So it's really interesting, actually. I sort of looked at that and thought, well, actually, if you're actually getting twice as wet by running, by presenting twice as much of your body to the falling droplets, then even if you're moving twice as fast, you're still going to get just as wet if you're walking in only in half the time getting to the rain. So it's all really interesting. I'd like to do more maths on that because it could be quite right. Maybe people are just ridiculously stupid by running when it's raining because they're just making themselves more wet. I hadn't thought about that. But it's another example of how everybody does things. They assume that this is the done thing. If it's raining, oh, quick, get out of the rain! I haven't got my raincoat. I haven't got my umbrella. I better get out of the rain quickly, quickly. It's actually making them more wet. Interesting. It's curious because it'd be good. Suddenly somebody publishes a scientific paper and proves conclusively that human beings do actually become more wet by running to a destination to get out of the rain than say walking at a leisurely pace. So if they got peer reviewed and then published in Nature magazine and Scientific American or some other publication, and also made it its way into the mainstream news, so that billions upon billions of people was just suddenly to be aware of the fact that, hey, you actually don't, you actually get wetter by running when it's raining. Will it change people's behavior? Just like as in the 70 to 80% of studies done on masks being effective in any form of respiratory droplet spread disease such as influenza. All of the studies so far have shown that cloth masks actually make you more liable and more likely to actually catch whatever disease it is you're trying to protect yourself from as a personal protection equipment scenario. So prophylaxis in medicine is where you block a certain type of pathogen or something that can infect you to stop it from infecting you. So it's called prophylaxis. It's from a Greek word that probably just means protection or something. So we've got like prophylactics, condoms, etc. You've got that stops the sperm from coming out. And then you've got gloves. That's a form of prophylaxis, where you put rubber gloves on so that your actual skin doesn't come in contact, with something you're handling. Using apparently the studies that were done on cloth masks going back for actually over 100 years, and the meta-analysis that was done by some of the leading experts on this have shown quite conclusively that cloth masks do absolutely nothing and actually put you at greater risk, particularly when they get wet. If you're in an environment, particularly if you're inside, if you're in an environment around people who are projecting droplets of potentially virally loaded moisture droplets and things. So, you just read this and you go, well, why have all these guys, minority, actually haven't done any proper peer-reviewed studies? We haven't done any proper peer-reviewed studies, and pretty much talking through a hole in your ass based on almost unpeer-reviewed stuff. And now the whole world is going, you've got to wear a mask or you'll be shot because you're a murderer if you don't wear a mask, or some bullshit, which is absolute crap. Because if you look at the actual science, the proper science that has been done till the cows come home, concerning cloth masks, particularly cloth masks, especially cloth masks, even surgical masks, they are designed to stop you infecting others, right? That's why they're used in a clinical setting. That's why they're used in medicines, to stop the surgeon from, I don't know, a bit of saliva dripping out of his fucking mouth into while they're doing sort of abdominal surgery or whatever. It's pretty obvious why they use. So in relation to diseases, and viroids are so incredibly small, they will pass through any type of cloth. It doesn't matter how closely woven it is. If you can breathe through it, the viroid can pass through it. I mean, there's no problem. They're smaller than fucking animal cells. They're so much smaller than even an animal cell. The sizes of them are so small. It's like comparing a grain of sand to it's ridiculous. I mean, so you've got an open door and the wind blows and a whole lot of sand blows through the door. Okay, so imagine that door is a gap between the weave and the fibers of the cloth thing you've got in front of you, and those grains of sand are the viroids, you know. And if they're dry, they're blowing. If you're breathing in, you are sucking them through the cloth. If they don't, if they actually somehow magically get trapped in the cloth, then that makes it even more of a worry, because you're going to actually end up having to touch the mask, or people who don't know what they're doing are going to end up making themselves at more risk of infection. They're going to be taking it off, putting it in their pocket. I mean, fuck, you might as well just have a bloody handkerchief and just go, oh, when somebody's around you, or just do this. I mean, for fuck's sake, it's ridiculous. They're enforcing this mask rule when it actually flies in the face of accepted real medical science. It's completely wrong. It's twisted. Yet everyone goes, oh, yeah, look, we're going to be safe. Oh, yeah, look, I'll wrap thing around the safe and we'll be safe. Yeah, all going to be good now. It's all good. Yep. And they're completely wrong. They haven't been trained in how to use masks as a form of PPE. You know, it's ridiculous. The governments of the world, by making these mandates, are actually putting people at risk, more risk, and actually, you know, and it's just wrong. It's just so wrong. You know, and then you've got all these other weird notions, like, you know, that social distancing and lockdowns are going to, you know, save lives. Well, no, they're not. Again, you know, so I'm getting a lot of my information now. I've actually been going again and again, not to a few other places, but mainly the Swiss policy research site, where they do meta analyses. A meta analysis is where you particular thing. Let's say, for example, we're doing a study on. A good example is just the mask thing again. So they got all of the available information that is around in the world, with a team of people to sort of like look at all of the evidence for and against, what the data came in as, what the studies showed, and then reach a conclusion, weighing up all of the studies and all of the research. To me, that is a very good way of doing stuff. You can't just base your science on one person's research findings in something as large as this. You need to do case studies that have been carried out in various ways with controls and say even placebos and et cetera, et cetera. So, and it's surprising to me how so many decisions are being made, and that the World Health Organization, for example, are recommending that, where they've completely turned around from what they were saying before April, and then reversed and turned on its head the official, you know, United Nations thing. So whoever these advisors are, they're manipulating these. They're manipulating these recommendations, but it really, I mean, it really looks like they're manipulating it in order to serve a particular agenda. Whether or not it's mask manufacturers making money, who knows? It could be, or is it a test run? Are they trying to see how far they can push the human race to be compliant and obedient to authority? Is it one big, massive mass psychology experiment? I think it might be, because it's looking more and more like nobody is actually listening to the true experts, and they're going more and more again to listening to billionaires who really have no qualifications in any of these areas, like medicine, but are paying into what they think are good courses, but are just going into the hands of huge pharmaceutical companies like GlaxoSmithKline and the other ones who manufacture trillions and trillions of vaccines that obviously do harm to thousands, considering the number of people who are complaining about what happened to, their little Johnny or their children or even themselves, as in damage or even being killed by them because they were dodgily made. You know, there is definitely censorship going on in the internet right now. It's so obvious it's not funny. It's bordering on the type of censorship that happened before the Second World War when when they were burning books in Berlin. That was happening before and during the war. Anything that went against the dictate of the new order, the Nazi sort of machine, was sort of summarily burnt and suppressed. And if you spoke out against them, they just shoot you. So he hasn't quite got that far, but it's starting to look at each as everybody's individual voice and ability to speak for themselves or even have an opinion is being surreptitiously stripped away from us. We are heading down a slippery slope towards where even George Orwell would not even have imagined how how much we are being monitored in this sort of global surveillance state, a one state type thing, where everyone and all of the information who are shoppers who use money in a global economy are now so monitored that even the market uh, for marketing of these industries, particularly online industries, is listening to you all the time and knowing where you're what you're looking at and why, and then using artificial intelligence to target advertising at you, which is very interesting. I mean, they couldn't do that with television. They couldn't go, oh, well, they've changed to this channel. They had to do that with sort of like questionnaires and ringing you up with market research. They'd have to like ask people in person. But now they don't have to ask you anything. They didn't even have to ask your permission to use the information derived from your preferences of online activity to generate advertising that targets you as specifically as an individual from your device, which is sort of wrong, really. I mean, how can they legally be using this information for marketing or purposes or for their businesses without your permission? They used to have to ask your permission once upon a time. I was actually involved years ago in the 90s with a group that did this type of marketing and would get people sort of like to answer questionnaires about what they liked and what they didn't like, and even actually provided products for you to test. It still happens now. And you get all this free stuff. They give you money. They ask you to let your friends try and use them, or try their products and give them feedback to what they think about it, and then and they'd have to ask you permission first. And it's all this metadata. It's valuable. It's very, very valuable to the multinational corporate companies that's because a lot of them are multinational. They're huge. They they have outfits in every country of the world. They're multi-billion-dollar industries that have their hands in associated industries that support their primary industry. McDonald's is a good example. McDonald's is possibly one of the most evil companies in the world, really. when it comes to workers' rights, what they're doing to the environment, how bad the food is for people, and how unhealthy it is. Even though they were trying to promote it as healthy in the 80s and 90s, they were trying to get sports people to promote their burgers and say, oh, and their milkshakes and stuff. So, I think that guy from the Globetrotters. Oh no, that uh, basketballer. Yeah. But anyway, so yeah, and several others, tennis players, etc. They're sort of like they're trying to promote their burgers as healthy, and then they also have the evil, insidious way that they target children as well, with their McDonald's toys and the little playgrounds they set up, with in their little plastic, plastic. I don't even think you can call it a restaurant really. Feeding center, I suppose. And is it really food? Don't know. If you look really deeply into McDonald's products, look at their pennies, look at everything, where it all comes from, how they conduct their business, you will realize that they are really quite evil. And anybody buying McDonald's hamburgers or supporting them are actually contributing to the destruction of the Amazon, to monocultures that are very bad for the planet, to you're also supporting chemical industries that are destroying the earth with their organochlorides, which are, the pesticides and also the fertilizers that are used in these types of beef and dairy. No, beef. Sorry, only beef cattle farms that are basically just for beef. They're just for meat. And they own these now. McDonald's aren't just on the surface a bunch of plastic restaurants with a clown running around going "Eat me" or whatever. They have huge holdings in vast and massive companies that are deforesting the Amazon as we speak, promoting cattle farming and all over the world, really. It's still going on. But, doesn't make it into the news, not normally. No, because, they own the news. They own all of it. That whole plastic sort of, petrochemical based military industrial complex. All of its products are based on sucking oil out of the crust. All the plastics, they're all made from oil. Everything is made from the oil industry, and then it feeds the huge military machines of the superpowers, who are then funded by banks. You've probably heard it all before, for people like David Icke, who got a lot of it right, who fund NATO, but also fund all the other ones. And, all of this stuff is going on behind the scenes, which Julian Assange was actually revealing with WikiLeaks, how, there is so much corruption. And what about the bailouts? Remember the bailouts that happened after, September 11 and all of that big burst that happened in 2004 where billionaires was just bankrupt overnight and owed trillions to everybody else, and America's still in debt by trillions of dollars to the rest, mainly China actually. So this global debt thing. So who's the debt to? So if a country has a debt, okay, so they owe another country a certain amount or whatever, but then that country is also in debt to other countries. So building to anybody, the world of economics, how those guys get away with all that. How did those guys get away walking away from when the bubble burst in 2004 to still being multi-millionaires with their private mansions and yachts and stuff? And, and only a few of them ended up taking ended up being thrown in jail or whatever. But that's just ridiculous, too many too many injustices that aren't being brought to the fore or being revealed in today's world. I believe. I think we're also have a current generation of people who have also been very effectively brainwashed not to think for themselves, and yeah, um, it's quite sad, really. There's so much promise for the human race, yet it's being constantly restricted and slowed down um, by people trying to take advantage of others in order to have a good time from their sense of power and stuff, and having excess wealth. And in a world where everybody basically gave to the common wealth of everyone, then surely there would be no haves or have-nots, and there would be easily abundance for all. If the motivations behind technology and all the inventions, all the things that we've done to make our lot easier in life, were truly to actually give us a better and easier life, then surely we would be living better and easier lives. There wouldn't be starving tens of thousands of people living in slums, like slums, and at the base of mega cities surrounded by toxins that are killing their babies, or starving to death in Ethiopia, or well, it's not Ethiopia now, is it? Which country is it now? It's having the worst. It's just ridiculous. Human beings, what is wrong with us? Do we not care about our fellow brother and sister on the earth enough to? I mean, people used to care once. I mean, I know I care. I try to keep my selfishness down to a minimum. I attempt to spread words of what I feel are good things to others. I play music to make people happy, and I do things which I think uplift the world in ways which aren't material, but more sort of spiritual and psychological and emotional. Uh, because to me, those things are worth more if you can put the activities which make other people's lives more bearable, or more enjoyable, or or can appreciate life more. Uh, to me, people who live in that way in service to others are doing a much greater job for us as a whole on the planet as a human race than those who use others to accumulate wealth by subjugating them in a hierarchy where whatever they're doing is it's only service is only in service towards that one particular head honcho. That type of class or societal structure belongs to the jungle, belongs to things like chimpanzees and gorillas. I think we have transcended our surely animal nature to the point where we can subdue and control it, to the point where we are able to be uh, motivated in our actions um, not by our former instinct, but now by our abilities to use reason and develop our own senses of fairness or principles that don't rely on, say, a reptilian or lower animalistic. I say it's lower because it is lower animalistic nature. Higher nature will be able to abstractly observe these processes and then adjust their own processes accordingly from a vantage point that is able to not be a slave to its instincts, but an observer of its instincts. And as an observer of our instincts, we are able to, in some way, dominate those to something more desirable for others. So if you are hungry, rather than clobber the person next to you eating a sandwich over their head to eat their sandwich because you're hungry, you ask them to share it with you by using some form of civil communication. So, there's a good example. So, in ways that don't imitate our more primitive animal relatives, such as, say, lizards, then the more we're able to organise our society and our social constructs to have greater fairness and all of the things that we regard as being human in our organisational anatomy. And that brings me to the last section here of this rambling, where I would like to talk about spirit. I'd like to talk about the soul. So often we leave types of things as considerations to our clergymen, clergywomen, our people of the cloth, in our various faiths or religions that we might adhere to. I'm talking here not about religion, I'm talking about spirituality. I'm talking about the idea of sound right, because the whole idea of spirit, etc., is born out of, has come from religious traditions and faiths. But it is possible in this day and age to also look at religions in the same way that we look at instincts and human behaviour and stuff. So we can get an overview. This is why I studied religious studies at university. I wanted to get an idea of what the various views were of spirituality and, say, how people regard creation or the universe around us, the miracle of existence, all of those things, what they mean, how they came into being, what factors come into play there, what cultures, invented what to explain this, that, and the other. So, it's a huge topic. I don't want to actually start going on about because I'll probably talk for hours if I was to start at the very beginning. But in the end, if you look across the board at all the spiritual traditions and the various religions, there are many things that they have in common. Almost all religions at one stage or another, not so much these days, but as you go back a few hundred years, there was a definite belief in what we call spirit. The spirit is invisible force or energy that is around everywhere. And this is what I'll start talking about because I know about these types of things, because I spent much time collecting textbooks in relation to this type of thing. Everything from the ancient occult, Eastern wisdom to modern parapsychology since the founding of the Society of Psychical Research in England back in the 19th century. Much investigation has been done in these areas and is still continuing to be done. So I will talk about spirit now and how our awareness of spirit. There are two types of ways of understanding spirit. So we can see spirit or feel spirit in one way as an instinctual thing that we had to know or have a sixth sense in the wild, have a sense that something is looking at you. It's still valid, I must add, of that and every aware or sentient being that is looking outwards sends out a ray from its eye towards the thing that is looking at. This was actually an accepted theory, and it's not so accepted now, but there might be something in it because, as everybody knows, you can always, or most people, I mean, some people don't, but a lot of people do, can sense and feel when somebody is staring intently at them. Like how often, like how I've seen this happen before, a bloke who's looking at some attractive lady that's walking down the road or looking at their bum or whatever, whatever they do, their legs or their hair or something like that. And suddenly the woman is sort of like gets the sense that somebody's looking at them, then instantly turns around and looks at them. Or the other way around. I've had the same thing. I've had like women staring at me or something, and I've felt like somebody's looking at me, or even a man looking at me. It doesn't matter really who it is or really why they're looking at you, but you can actually get this feeling that someone is looking at you. That is a sixth sense. That is a real and palpable sixth sense that we all, at some stage, must have experienced. Most people have experienced. So, there is one example of how spirit works. You don't know how it is that you know or sense or feel that somebody is looking at you, but when you do, you know where it's coming from, and then you end up looking back at them, and they're looking at you, and you look into their eyes and go, well, "What are you staring at?" And even though they were behind you. I mean, how often does that happen? I mean, always, all the time, every day, with loads of people. So here's a good example of how spirit moves amongst the people, yet it is not really acknowledged by science, right? So how is it that you know that somebody is looking at you at the and behind your back? And these types of experiments have been done since about, I don't know, the mid 19th century. The Rhine Institute, I think they did a series of very, very good studies on this. That was at the Duke Institute. No, the Rhine Institute, which is part of, I think it was something called the Duke University. It's one of the universities in America where in the 50s they were doing quite extensive research into psychic phenomena before the war, actually. Sorry, I think that was in the 1930s. Most of their research was done in prediction, precognition, the ability to sort of like predict the fall of dice or toss of a coin. A lot of the mathematics involved in that have been put down by later mathematicians who have reinvented probability. I don't know how they can do that. How can you reinvent the laws of probability? You can't. You know. So yeah, a lot of those experiments are still just as valid then as they are now, even if you don't agree with the methodology. So, talking about spirit, the unacknowledged spirit, in the secular, physicalist, materialist ethos of Western society, exist, even though they do. So, yes. So, getting back to spirit. So, in the realm of spirit, there is a huge gap. There's a huge element of human organizational naturalness that is being ignored. We haven't acknowledged spirit. We leave it to various religions that some of them are a bit dry and boring, Christianity, etc. They don't talk about spirit much, but some of the Eastern traditions they do. Like, for example, Taoism and Shintoism and sort of those types of Eastern religions. It's a very real thing that is used in things like Tai Chi, Qigong, uh, acupuncture, and in their sort of forms of medicine, where this energy, the spirit energy, is acknowledged and a very real thing. And this is, I believe, what we need to catch up with in the West in order to organize and structure our societies properly. We need to acknowledge spirit. We need to acknowledge the spiritual dimension of human existence. We need to acknowledge that in such a way that we know that there is something there that guides also our thoughts and our actions, not just what we're being told by the meat machine aficionados. So I'll get into that later on my next discourse of ramblings of weirdness, but I'll go back to that same point I was talking about before about how spirit itself and how it affects us is there. It's always there. It's not something we can ignore because it's part and parcel of every living. Surely it should be our duty to try and find as much about it as possible, and maybe even apply it to our lives in some way. And so I'm getting back to that point again of how that relates to authorities and authoritarianism and creativity is that also a lot of the creative people around in the world who like innovative and experiment with things and try and create new and wonderful ways of either doing things or are inventive in that way, uh, often have also a keen sense of being aware of that spirit. I think we've lost a lot of our ability to be in touch with this force or this energy, having removed ourselves so far from the natural kingdom of the the ecological environment that we are part of as animals. Animals have an amazing sixth sense. They are absolute experts when it comes to being sort of psychics and feeling out vibes and knowing what the moods are of that. Could be because they have other heightened senses like their senses of smell. They can tell if somebody's sweating a certain way. They smell a bit different because they're feeling a bit anxious or sad or whatever. You know, there are very ordinary explanations as to why they seem to have senses that seem to be moving beyond the five senses that are received by their sense organs: ears, nose, mouth, eyes, skin, etc. Touch, smell, etc. But there is another element to all of those senses. Spirit is within all of those senses and can augment those senses immensely. This has been also borne out by psychic research going back to the nth degree, to the point where if you eliminate all of those senses from a person, they can still receive sensory information. And it's not known how you receive that, whether or not the brain might or the nervous system might work as some radio receiver or an aerial that's picking up information that is coming from a type of energy that's being transferred at a quantum level that is neither electricity or magnetism. It is something else that is invisible. This is where the realm of spirit lies, and that is our next step in our evolution of discovering what we are and how we fit into everything else. It is in the realm of consciousness and spirit. Without consciousness, without spirit, we are doomed, because all we are doing is we're heading down a track towards utter materialism that continues to ignore the subtle energies that are behind all of the things that make us human. For example, love, emotions, our intuition, our hunches about things. These things, as we head down to a materialistic track, the materialistic sciences, as we head towards down that road and ignore the spirit, ignore the subtle, and it's almost like we're blinding ourselves. It's like cutting our noses off to spite our face so that we don't actually smell anymore. We're denying a very important aspect of what it is to be a complete human. So I think I might end my little chat there to myself, and I will expound in my next discourse uh, what I know about psychic research from the top of my head. I don't have my library at hand. I did once. I books. I collected many books about particularly psychic research, and I still have a good memory of remembering, prominent researchers and general uh, things that they did in their researches. And if I had my library, I could go and grab the particular book and then sort of read bits from it, but I don't have access to it right now. So I'm just going to have to give you just general ideas of what I remember from reading all these hundreds of books going back concerning psychic research to at least the mid 19th century. One very particularly interesting one I picked up about 10 years ago was William Crookes, who was actually a very prominent and very well known physicist in the Victorian area, who went around trying to sort of to debunk a lot of like fake spiritualists that were around. There were quite a lot of them at that time. He was successful in actually being able to reveal a lot of frauds back then. But there's a big but here. William Crookes discovered amongst those hundreds of frauds, well, I don't know if they're hundreds, and they're dozens, hundreds of fraudulent spiritualist mediums, there was a how they were able to get information from the beyond, certain objects moving around the room. In one case, in the 1890s, I believe, one particular person going into a somnambulistic trance who was utterly catatonic, his body having become completely rigid, floated out of a room, out of a window that was 2 stories high. And this is witnessed by dozens of people in this large room in London, and also outside, who saw him go outside through the window while he was in this catatonic trance, stretched out like the person would be lying on a bed, and went out the window Then back in again. William Crookes was I think he was actually present when that happened, but he got the written testimony of real levitation, witnessed by and unexplainable, really, because if he'd been suspended by strings or ropes or whatever, you would have been able to see them. Obviously, it was in broad daylight. He went up a window. Now, how is that possible? It's not. He floated out the window, floated out there for a wee while, then came back in again. That was there. That's one of the cases that he covered. That is covered in this interesting volume I got. It was a publication to the Society of Psychical Research, reprint of something that was printed about 1890 something. But yeah, it's all very interesting. So I think I might talk about those topics and how they relate to what I think we need to do as a human race in order to advance further, um, and perhaps inspire others to look into this area of parapsychology, which is another science that this seems to have been censored. I mean, some of the great researchers from the 70s and 60s who were putting a lot of energy into this field are now being called pseudoscientists and other horrible things on things like Wikipedia. One of them, like Russell Targ, for example. Oh my God! I mean, he is not just a parapsychological researcher. He also does things in mainstream science. He's a well-known physicist. He developed some amazing applications for lasers, I think, and a lot of other things, a lot of hardcore science stuff, which is undeniably not pseudoscience. Just because he's taken an interest in looking at these areas of psychic research doesn't mean he is a pseudoscientist. It just means he's an actual scientist who's interested in areas that are on the fringe of knowledge. I you know, there are too many skeptics out there who all they want to do is actually completely just shut down anything that goes against what they believe in their conservative, what they've been told by, the traditional mainstream in science. It's just wrong. They should just try and have some respect for some of these new areas of inquiry and investigation that could be massive breaks for this new generation of people interested in consciousness. Just become very trendy these days, and fortunately, I know a lot about it because I've just read so many books about it. I've collected so many books about it, so I can just sort of give you interesting stories that relate to things like levitation and experiments in telepathy, experiments in sharing, say, I will get into that next time because it's now an hour and 6 minutes, and I will see you anon when I decide to stream some more babblings to YouTube. Have a nice evening.